Hey everyone, welcome to your lesson summary video on completing the square part 2. So completing the square can be a useful method for solving quadratic equations. Oh boy, let's see if we can get this to fit. Ooh. So for solving quadratic equations, in cases in which it is not easy to rewrite the expression in factored form. So just remember, factored form so far has been our easiest, quickest way of solving, but a lot of equations you can't rewrite in factored form equal to 0, so completing the square is another method when factored form is impossible. So here we have an example, x squared plus 5x minus 75 equals 0. So to solve by completing the square, we want to get this term to the other side of the equation. So let's just go ahead and add 75 to both sides, just to make this a little bit easier on ourselves. So that's going to give us x squared plus 5x equals, now if we add 75 to the other side, it will be a positive 75 over on that side. All right, so for completing the square, remember we take our b term right here. We're going to divide it by 2, so maybe I'll do a little work off on the side. We take that b value, 5, we divide it by 2, and then we want to square that. So that means you square the 5 and you square the 2. 5 squared is 25, 2 squared is 4. We're going to add this to each side. So we're going to have x squared plus 5x plus that b over 2 and then squared is 25 fourths. Well, if we're going to add 25 fourths to one side of the equal sign, we're going to add 25 fourths to the other side. We're just keeping this a balanced equation by whatever operation you do on one, you do on the other. So now we can go ahead and simplify this. These are 75 fourths plus 25 fourths. We do have a common denominator. So you can go ahead and add the numerators to get 100 over 4. And 100 over 4 is equal to 25. So we can rewrite our equation. We have x squared plus 5x plus 25 fourths equals 100 divided by 4, which is 25. So we completed the square, so we know this is a perfect square over here. This is a perfect square over here, so you have a perfect square equal to a perfect square. So we can rewrite that in factored form. Here we go. So this x squared plus 5x plus 25 fourths. When we go to our factored form, especially with these fractions and decimals, when it gets a little bit tricky, what goes in the parentheses with the x is always going to be that b over 2 value. When you took your b value and cut it in half, that's what's going to go in here. In this case, our b over 2 value was 5 halves. So it's going to be plus 5 halves equals 25. Okay, so if we're squaring something and getting 25, that means the thing we're squaring must equal a 5 or a negative 5. So we're going to write those two equations. X plus 5 halves equals 5. And then x plus 5 halves equals negative 5. And then we just have these two equations to solve. We'll subtract 5 halves from each side. And then here's where, if you're not using a calculator and we have to figure out 5 minus 5 halves is, well, we would need a common denominator. So think about that as being over 1. And it's going to be a pretty quick, let me multiply this by 2. So really, x is equal to 10 halves. That's the same thing as 5 halves minus 5 halves. you would subtract the numerators and get 5 and leave the denominator, the common denominator, the same. So there's one of our solutions, 5/2. The other equation, we're going to subtract 5/2 from both sides. So x equals -5 minus 5/2. Again, we can get that common denominator. Think of that -5 as being over 1. Multiply them both by 2. And we're going to get x equals -10/2. That has the same value as -5 minus 5/2. And -10 minus 5 is -15. And the 2 would stay the same. So that is our other solution. So it does take some practice to become proficient at completing the square. But this is just a nice way of solving that makes it possible to solve many more equations than we could have solved if we only knew how to use factored form equal to 0. So this opens up the door to solving more equations than we could have done with our first lesson.